Tuttle. I am Nicole Gagner, and I am going to share an art class with you. So hopefully you had a chance to do our first art class together, which was this kind of night sky inspired watercolor. If you haven't got a chance to do that one yet, I would recommend going back and doing that class first, just because we kind of went over a lot of the basic supplies and some kind of color mixing stuff. I mean, we'll go over them today too, so if you want to do them out of order, that's up to you. But let's get started. So before we really jump in, I'm going to show you just one example of what we're doing today. So we are kind of making our own take on the sunflower. So your finished product absolutely does not have to be a sunflower. It doesn't have to be a realistic sunflower, although it can be if you are a big fan of sunflowers and want to recreate that. But we are also going to be using a lot of fun color mixing and a lot of pattern making to kind of make our own version of it. So before you get started, you might want to take a little bit of time to assess your supplies. I am not by any means a watercolor purist, so I like mixing and matching things. So that means I will use Sharpies to kind of draw with in a like waterproof way that I can just paint over and not worry about. I will use white crayons if I want to do a little bit of wax resist or something like that. I will use whatever I have. If I have some colored pencils or crayons or things like that, and I think, hey, this could be a cool pattern or something, I want to try it out. So what you might want to do is set yourself up like a little tester sheet here. So what I've done with these, they're watercolor paper, but I kind of just chopped it down into little pieces, or if you have scraps or something like that. And then I kind of drew a pattern on them and then divided that into smaller patterns and kind of backfilled. I used these to experiment with what happens when I layer one colored pencil over another colored pencil, or what happens if I layer one crayon over another crayon. But you could use these for what happens if I use a marker and then I watercolor over it, if it's not a waterproof marker, things like that. So that's something that you can keep in mind, or you can just skip the practice and jump right into the sunflowers, and that's okay too. Kind of just depends on, do you want to play around a little bit and give yourself some ideas of like different patterns and shapes you can do. You can see with this one, I started with like kind of warm colors, so pinks, yellows, oranges. This one I didn't even do just cool colors. I did it mostly monochromatic, mostly just green. Monochromatic means it's just the one color scheme. So monochromatic can be black and white, or in this case, it's different shades of green. So you might want to experiment with your color palette, things like that. Another thing that you could do quickly before you get started, if you wanted to sketch yourself out a little color wheel here, I just really quickly did my primary colors, red, yellow, blue, my secondary colors that you get by mixing the primary colors. So when you mix yellow and red, you get orange. When you mix red and blue, you get purple. When you mix, sorry, I'm doing it backwards here. It's hard to see. When you mix the yellow and the blue, you get the green. And then in between each of those primary and secondary colors, there's a color called a tertiary color. Those have really uncreative names like yellow green, blue green, things like that. But you might want to make yourself a little color wheel just so you can kind of see like, oh, okay, so if I mixed red and yellow, I would get that orange. If I mixed red and orange, I would get that red orange. So you can kind of have a little visual clue to yourself if you start mixing stuff together, or if you have like a red petal next to a blue background and you think that they might mix together. Well, what would happen? Oh, it would make a purple. That would be okay. So those are some of the things that you can kind of do to practice to plan things out. So if you want to pause, make yourself a color wheel or make yourself a little pattern practice page, that's great. If you want to jump right into sunflowers, that's awesome too. I'm going to switch to my top-down camera so that you can see my desk. Whenever we work in watercolor, it works better to work flat. As you can imagine, if your paper gets really, really wet and you have it tilted up or up, like I have an easel behind me, but that's not a watercolor. If I tried to work on watercolor on that, it would all just kind of drip, which could be a cool effect, but maybe not what we're going for in this case. So we'll work flat unless we want to tilt it up to drip it. So I will switch my camera. So I will set aside these. Remember, were just my examples for trying out different patterns, things like that. That can be really fun just to get the creative juices flowing. but I've got a couple examples of different sunflowers I've made, and you can see here this was layered with some waterproof marker, but then where the white is, that was the wax resist that was done with the crayon. So you can do kind of a combination of that, and you can kind of pre-plan out, do you want more of like a realistic color scheme here with kind of a playful pattern in the middle, or do you want something that's really kind of out there? This was a little bit of like almost like a galaxy color scheme, although you can see I kind of contrasted with like a monochromatic center and then kind of played around with a little bit of wax resist on the outside in different ways. This one had drawn pattern in the center and then painted pattern on the outside, and you will have a chance to kind of play around with that. Also, this has like a little bit of layered pattern and painted pattern, both drawn and painted there. And then this one, I showed you that color wheel at the beginning. If you really were inspired by that color wheel and kind of wanted to make your own flower version of a color wheel, that's something that you could do too. And you could see with these, there's kind of a little bit of thought given to the negative space. Do I want the petals to go all the way to the edge? Or if I have the petals kind of floating in the middle here, then what do I do with that space around the outside? Negative space is just anywhere that your main image isn't. So in this case, our flower is our main image, so the space in between the petals is kind of our negative space there. Whereas here, the flower is the main image, so everything kind of around it is the negative space. So anytime in art that you have something kind of floating in the center there, you want to make sure to use all of that extra space so that it doesn't seem like it was an afterthought necessarily. If I was revisiting this idea, I would maybe even make the flower a little bit bigger, or have some of the petals touch the edges and kind of like break the plane, it's called, where it like goes out of the space, or even maybe could I shift this flower to be off center just to make it a little bit more visually interesting. But that's kind of one of those things that you can play around with in art. I tried it this way, so could I try it a different way? But right now we're going to kind of visit that big flower taking up the whole page idea. And you can definitely pre-sketch this with like some pencils or something if you want. Anytime you're drawing on watercolor paper with pencil, you want to make sure to not press too hard. Watercolor paper is pretty thick and kind of soft so that it will absorb all of that watercolor. But that means if you press too hard with your pencil, it can leave a divot in your page where the watercolor will kind of pool and it might look a little bit unintentional. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind is if I draw with pencil and then paint over the top of it, pencils are not waterproof. They're not lead either. The center of a pencil is filled with something called graphite. And that's any pencil, number 2 pencil, specialty drawing pencils, anything like that. Most of them are made out of graphite, and graphite is water soluble. So it might smudge and smear a little bit if you paint right over the top of it. Unlike, where did my marker go here? I have a Sharpie or any other permanent marker or waterproof marker is not water soluble. It's not washable. It's not going to get washed around by the water. So if I make marks with a Sharpie, I don't have to worry about them smudging and smearing. So one thing that I could do, I could draw it with a pencil and then go back and trace it with a Sharpie. Or if I'm feeling brave, I could just jump right in with the Sharpie and know that if I make any mistakes, they just become part of the art, and that's part of the fun of it. So that's what I'm going to choose to do today. But if you would rather start with a pencil and then maybe trace it with a marker and erase your lines, that's totally fine too. Just keep in mind you don't want to press too hard with any of the pencils so that we don't crease our paper. Another option you have, if you had something circular on hand and you wanted to trace around that to make your sunflower center an absolute perfect circle, that's fine. But I will bring back one of my examples here because I never trace the center. I always just kind of freehand it, and you can see they're definitely not perfect. I'm an artist, I have lots of practice, but that doesn't mean I've practiced drawing circles necessarily. So they do come out a little bit uneven, but I personally don't mind it. I kind of like that things in nature are a little bit uneven and imperfect, just like my petals are all kind of different shapes and sizes, and I don't mind that either. But it's a personal preference. I don't mind the unevenness. If you know it's going to drive you nuts, that's fine. Go find a cup or something to trace. Totally fine. But I'm just going to jump in and freehand it. a little bit of a smudge on this paper. I might flip it over, which is actually a good time for me to talk about. There are two sides to this paper, but for watercolor paper, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a right and a wrong side. I can try to hold this up here. It might be a little bit too dark, but watercolor paper a lot of times has a side that has a little bit of texture, and then it has a side that has a smoother side. And both of them are usually fine to paint on. A lot of times watercolor paper has been treated with something called sizing, just to keep it nice and smooth and flat. But that's not something you super duper need to worry about unless you know that you're going to be doing like lots of glazing. That means like layering layers of watercolor. So for just a fun, student activity like this, I wouldn't really worry about the texture or finish of the paper beyond, do you like it? Do you like the smoother side or the bumpier side? Totally up to you. If I was doing like a really intricate drawing or something, I might want to choose the smoother side. If I was doing something that was like really, really loose, I might want the texture of that bumpy side, just as a personal preference. But there's really not a right or a wrong here. So choose whichever side you prefer for this. All right, so I'm just going to jump in. Like I said, I'm going to freehand my circle here, knowing that if it's a little bit uneven, that is okay. In fact, of course, it's going to be a little bit uneven. I'm human. All right, so that's my center. And then, like I said, I'm going to try to make my petals go to the edges. But again, knowing that they're all going to be a little bit different. Some of them might touch and overlap. Some of them might have a little bit more space between them, and that's okay. That's kind of, again, the fun of nature. Things aren't exactly perfect. So I will just keep going here and have petals all the way around my paper. Of course, these ones that are closer to the edges here won't be exactly the same shape because we know that some of this petal is running off of the edge there. I will just make them as big as I can. I think it's just a little bit more interesting when the petals kind of take up a lot of the page, but if your flower ends up with smaller petals or something, that is okay. This is your piece of art. You get to make it how you want it. In the art world, we call that the artist's choice, or there's another word for it that I'm blanking on. There's a term for it, just meaning that you are the artist. You get to pick how your project is going to look at the end. All right, so I've got my circle, I've got my petals there. If you need to pause this for a little bit more time to draw your petals, of course, go ahead and do that now. But the next thing that I'm going to do is kind of divide up. I want to draw a pattern in the center of my sunflower here. I could also choose if I wanted to draw patterns on the petals, or even for a little bit of contrast, I could draw patterns behind the petals in that negative space that we were talking about. But for right now, I'm just going to concentrate my drawn pattern in the center here, knowing that I could always paint some pattern in later or make some changes later if I want to. So how I like to start this is just kind of make some lines. Some of them might be straight, some of them might be squiggly. And we'll just kind of vary it with, my marker is dying here. Let me see if I have a better one. We'll just kind of vary our lines and overlap them, let them intersect, and create some interest that way. Maybe some of these lines will touch, maybe some of them won't. And I'm just going to make a variety of lines here, and they don't all have to go from edge to edge. So far I've made every line start at an edge and finish at an edge, but if you have a line that maybe turns in the middle, that's okay too. What I'm trying to do with these lines here, I'm trying to divide up this space so that each of these little shapes that's created in here can be filled up with a whole different pattern. But if I have some big shapes here, I might get kind of bored of drawing that pattern by the end of it. So maybe I'll just divide up some of these bigger shapes here. And it's kind of fun to vary the type of line. So I've got some curvy lines in here. I've got some straight lines. And you can see when we put straight lines in there, it kind of becomes geometric shapes, right? Like there's sort of rectangular shapes in there. There's sort of a triangle up there. And then when I have these curvy lines, they make something, it's called an organic shape, where it's just maybe more like amoeba-like or water-like, these things from nature that don't really have certain specific shapes. So that's kind of fun that you can kind of make up some shapes and put some real shapes in there too. So now that I've filled that up with the variety, I'm going to draw different patterns in each of my little areas of my center here. Now I could definitely do that with my Sharpie, and that would look a little bit like this. I did this one with a thicker Sharpie. Of course, if you vary the size of your Sharpie, it's going to change it. This one was with a thinner Sharpie. So you can see that was filled up with different drawn patterns there. Or you could grab a white crayon like I'm going to do right now, and I'm just going to fill this up with different patterns. You won't be able to see these while I'm drawing here, but just know that I'm doing kind of different shapes, different patterns, and it will be kind of a fun surprise when I paint over it at the end. Not at the end, but on the next step. When I paint over my white crayon, it's all just going to kind of pop out and come to life, which is the magic of wax resist. When you paint over it, all of a sudden, woo, there it is, even though you couldn't see it exactly. And I probably could have varied up my patterns a little bit more here, but I was talking. So do a better job than me. Concentrate more than I did. So then once I grab, I just have a, this is just a student grade palette, nothing super special. When you have watercolor that's dried in the shapes here, it's called pan watercolor. A lot of times these student grade sets are a little, they have a little bit less pigment in them than the artist grade sets, and they're a little bit less expensive because of that. So sometimes they are a little bit chalkier, but for projects like this, I think they're super, super fun. If you start getting frustrated that you can't quite mix the exact colors that you want, or if the colors are a little bit chalkier than you want, then I recommend going to an artist grade set. So something like Winsor Newton or Gamblin. There's lots of great watercolor makers out there if you're willing to invest a little bit more money in it. But for just getting started, these sets are really fun, and I personally don't mind them for just kind of playing around with. So in our first lesson, we did something called a wash. So that's what I'm going to start with again here, where I just have a wet brush. Our wash, last time we washed across the whole page. This time I'm going to wash just a little bit at a time, just to have a little bit more control. So if I wash just the center here first, so I kept everything in that center line there. And now when I dab colors over the top of it, you can see they're just going to kind of flow together there. And my white crayon should start popping out here, so hopefully we'll kind of see that coming forward. So I'm just kind of dabbing in some browns and some blacks for kind of that traditional sunflower look, but of course you can put any color you like in your sunflower. I like personally to have a little bit of a contrast between the center, the petals, and the background. So what I mean by contrast is just difference, basically. So if I make a really dark center, then maybe I want the petals and the background to be lighter, or maybe I'll still have the background be dark, but a different color of dark, and then have the petals be light, or something like that. You absolutely do not have to follow my color scheme. You don't even have to follow my plan of contrast, but that's just kind of how I like to think about it. If you kind of splash a little bit around like I did, don't stress with watercolor. We can always take our paper towel and kind of dab it up. And if it doesn't come all the way up, that's not the end of the world, because we still are going to paint over this. And actually taking your paper towel and pulling up watercolor like this, like I'll show you, I have kind of a puddle forming here. So if I'm worried that that's going to break free and kind of flow away, I can take my paper towel and dab up the edges there. It's taking the watercolor, the water with it, so it's going to also lift some of the watercolor up with it. And that's what it's called. It's called lifting. And you can actually use it in a way where you kind of crinkle it up and get some texture there, or have the texture of the paper towel showing through. And that's a totally legitimate technique. You're allowed to say that, oh, I didn't make a mistake. I wasn't erasing that. I was just lifting. But the thing that's nice about it is you can kind of, if it gets a little bit too dark, you can lift it up and then you have the option to go back over it later. And if your colors are all getting a little bit too dark, my recommendation is to use your lid. Hopefully your lid's a little bit cleaner than mine is. But what I like to do is I'll put a little bit of water in there, and then the color that I'm mixing and maybe getting too dark, I can put in there with some water, because the more water that you have added into your watercolor, the lighter it's going to be. So if your colors are just getting a little bit too dark, like when you're rubbing on any of your colors here, the more you kind of rub on there, the more color you'll get built up in your brush. So if you're just getting a little bit too much there, you can use your lid to add more water and have lighter colors there. All right. So remember when I talked about the color wheel, how if you have things next to each other and they're going to flow together, you kind of want to know what colors those will be. I was talking about that because anytime you have wet watercolor and you paint something wet next to it, they might flow together. So that's something I want to keep in mind here. Say I was going to do bright yellow petals here. Well, yellow mixed with brown is still going to be kind of brown, right? So if I don't want that to flow into my bright color, I probably want to wait and let it dry before I put anything next to it. So that means I could either draw on my petals here, or I could paint in my background, knowing that if I get wet color next to wet color there, it might flow a little bit, but I'm thinking I might try a dark blue in my background. So that wouldn't be so bad if I have some brown and black flowing into a dark blue. I don't think I'll mind how that looks. So that's kind of my plan for now. Not saying that you have to follow that plan at all, of course. That's just something to think about anytime we're working with color washes. When you have really, really wet paper, it can start to flow. See how that's kind of flowing in there? And so if you don't want that, like say that happened and I was like, oh my gosh, I don't want that at all. Grab your paper towel, lift it up a little bit, and then let that dry before you come back and try to paint anything, because it's still wet there now, so it's still going to flow. But if you don't mind the colors flowing there together, just let it happen. And I'm just going to play around with some blues and maybe even a little bit of black in my background here. I'm not adding anything super specific. Remember I said you can absolutely paint patterns and things in your background or even on your petals. But what would happen right now when I've kind of flooded these background zones and I've done this wet wash on them? What would happen if I tried to do a pattern here? I'll show you. Like I'll try to do like little polka dots here. It kind of looks polka dotty, but it doesn't stay very polka dotty, right? Because it's so wet that the watercolor just flows. So if I want a really, really precise painted pattern, I'll have to come back later when it's a little bit more dry and paint over the top of it. Or before I paint, I could draw something then, or I could wait until after I paint and wait until it's completely dry and then I can draw on top of it with anything. Another option, if you happen to have access to, there's a supply called Watercolor Pencils. They weren't included in our kit, but if you happen to have access to them, they're a ton of fun, and you can draw with them even on soaking wet watercolor paper. When you brush your water over the top of them, the colors will flow a little bit. But then if I took a watercolor pencil right now and drew on top of my wet paper, it would deposit the color and kind of stay there and work pretty well. So that's something that you could play around with also. So I will kind of let these dry a little bit before I do too much more, because again, these would all kind of flow together if I painted something right up next to it. Another thing I can do if I'm like, I really don't want to wait, and I don't mind having kind of a little bit of a gap, I can paint kind of up to the edge there, as long as there's a dry piece of paper in between the edge of one color and another, then they shouldn't flow together. Of course, the risk you run there is you get them too close and they kind of flow together. But you know what? I don't mind a little bit of that here. If you want to avoid that, the easiest way is just to wait until it all dries, of course. But I think it could be kind of neat to have a little white halo around the petals there. I could have definitely done a little bit of the white ring on the other side of the petals too. These are just things that you can kind of think about and play with as you are kind of experimenting with these later. I totally could have taken this time to like draw a little bit too. So if you would rather pause and draw with either a crayon or if you have a Sharpie or something like that that you want to draw with, now is a good time to do that too. I just thought it'd be fun to kind of get one layer of color down here and kind of show how you can start to finish this out. So you've got lots of options here. I think that's one thing that's really fun about art, is that it kind of can become our own thing. I should mention too, you can see my paper's kind of curling up a little bit. One thing I could have done, if that really, really bothered me, I could have taken some masking tape and kind of taped all of the edges down to my desk. I didn't do that here because I was just kind of jumping into the project and I'm regretting it a little bit. But if you are also kind of struggling with this, you could just put, you know, like a cup or something heavy on the edge of it to hold it down, or just put your finger on dry spots here. If it's really bothering you that it's curled once it's dry, sometimes they'll flatten themselves out, especially if the moisture kind of spreads out. But if it's still curling when it's dry, once it's completely dry and it's not wet at all, you can just stack some books on top of it and that should eventually even it out. So that is our sunflower there, and I'm just going to paint a little bit more pattern into the leaves here. Of course, remember, it's pretty wet, so if I wanted really, really detailed patterns here, I would have to wait until it dries a little bit more. But this is something that you can kind of experiment with, kind of make it your own. And you've got all of the tools and all of the ideas to really, you know, make this as unique as you want. And you can always keep adding more to it. That's never really a bad thing, to keep going and adding even more on top of it, especially if you kind of step back and look at it and it's a little bit light. With watercolor, you can really kind of layer and build that up. Just remember that anytime you add something on top of it while it's wet, it's going to really flow. So if you want it to kind of stay exactly where you put it, you might need it to dry a little bit more. But yeah, you can kind of make this as wild and crazy as you want. You can keep going back in and adding pattern. In some of these, I added kind of a little bit more green behind it so that it almost looked a little bit more like leaves. Some of these I added a lot more painted pattern behind it. It's kind of up to you to make it as intricate or as wild as you would like. And that is all I have for you. So hopefully now that you've got the supplies and you've got all of the instruction, you can really take this and make this your own. I'd love to see your pictures. Find me online. I'm easy to find. I'm Painter Nicole everywhere, and I would love to see your finished product. And thank you so much. I hope we get to paint together again sometime. Have a great one.